They ripped her badge off in the rain before the sun came up. Security had her by both arms, marching her through the ambulance bay, while the sliding doors hissed shut behind them. Instead, a man was dying on a trauma table, his chest filling with air that had nowhere to go, his heart beginning to shift. And the surgeon standing over him was the same man who had just called her a liability, a danger, a nurse who didn't know her place. "Get her out of my hospital." She didn't fight, she didn't cry. She walked into the freezing dark and stood in the parking lot while the rain came down hard enough to blur the lights. 23 minutes later, a Black Hawk helicopter shook the rooftop of Crestview Regional Medical Center like a thunderclap, and 4 armed men in tactical gear moved through the emergency department with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone step back without being told. They were asking for one person, the woman who had just been thrown out into the cold. Before this story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you stories like this one, people written off, pushed out, and underestimated, until the moment the truth catches up. Like this video, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The overnight shift at Crestview Regional started the way it always did. Understaffed, overlit, and running on bad coffee and worse attitudes. Hannah Brooks had worked the 11 to 7 for going on 2 years now, and she had learned early that the best way to survive it was to stay invisible. Not because she lacked confidence, not because she didn't know what she was doing, but because she had learned, very specifically, that the people who ran this hospital didn't want a night shift nurse with opinions. They wanted someone who would chart, medicate, turn over patients, and stay out of the way of people with more letters after their names. Hannah had more than letters. She had 4 years of Army combat medicine, 2 overseas deployments, a certification in trauma and critical care, and the kind of hands-on experience that most trauma surgeons at a regional hospital in Dunmore, Colorado, had never come close to. She didn't bring any of that up. She kept her head down, did her job, and went home before sunrise. Most nights, it worked. Tonight was not most nights. She was restocking supply carts in Bay 4 when the radio crackled at the nurse's station. A gurney incoming, GSW to the left thorax, no ID, BP dropping, ETA 4 minutes. She heard the charge nurse, a tired woman named Dolores, start making calls to pull whoever was available. The overnight trauma attending was Dr. Callum Price, who was decent if you caught him early in a shift. But Dr. Price had left at midnight with a migraine, and the on-call escalation had gone sideways, and the person who answered the page was Dr. Victor Lang. Hannah felt something tighten in her chest the moment she heard his name over the intercom. She'd worked with Lang twice before. The first time, he'd dismissed her pre-op assessment of a pediatric patient without reading it. The second time, he'd spoken over her mid-sentence while she was reporting to a family, then told her afterward that nurses should let physicians handle the communication parts. Howe was not incompetent across the board. His surgical record was clean enough on paper, but he had a specific blindness to input from people he considered beneath him, and that blindness, in Hannah's experience, was the most dangerous trait a trauma physician could have. She finished the supply cart anyway. Maybe it would be straightforward. Maybe Lang wouldn't need anyone's input, and the patient would roll through without complication. The gurney came through the doors at 2:14 a.m. Hannah was 3 feet away when she saw him. Male, somewhere in his late 30s, heavily built, the kind of physical conditioning you didn't get in a gym. The paramedics were calling out stats as they moved. GSW left lateral chest, entry wound between the 6th and 7th rib, exit wound unclear, O2 sat dropping, BP 84/60 and falling. She moved alongside the gurney automatically, not because anyone asked her to, but because that was what her body did. She was looking at his chest. His breath sounds were already off. She could hear it before they even got him onto the trauma table, a subtle shift in the quality of his respiration, the way the left side wasn't expanding the way it should. His trachea, when she looked, was sitting slightly off-center. His neck veins were starting to distend. She knew exactly what she was looking at. "Dr. Lang," she said, as they transferred the patient from the gurney. "I need to flag something. I'm seeing signs of tension pneumo, tracheal deviation, JVD. The breath sounds on the left are..." "I see the patient, nurse." Lang didn't look at her. He was snapping gloves on, barking orders at the tech for an intubation tray, calling for a chest x-ray. "Stand back. Sir, with respect, there may not be time for—" "I said stand back." His voice was flat and absolute, the voice of a man who had never once in his career considered that he might be wrong. "Get me the intubation set, and someone tell me why this nurse is still talking." Hannah stepped to the edge of the bay. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the patient. His sat was 81 and dropping. She pressed her fingers to the edge of the trauma table and watched Lang call for a portable chest film, watched him reach for the laryngoscope, watched the tech scramble to comply, and she did the math in her head the way she had learned to do it in a forward operating base outside of Kandahar, in a tent with a dirt floor and no imaging equipment and a soldier bleeding out in front of her, where there had been exactly one option and she had taken it without hesitating. She looked at the clock on the wall, 2:16 a.m. The X-ray tech was still setting up. The patient's BP on the monitor read 78/52. His oxygen saturation hit 76. Hannah crossed the bay. She didn't announce it. She didn't ask permission. She went to the supply drawer she had restocked 20 minutes earlier, pulled a 14-gauge needle, swabbed the patient's skin at the second intercostal space mid-clavicular line, and before anyone in the room fully processed what she was doing, she decompressed the chest. The release of pressure was audible. The patient's saturation began climbing within seconds, 78, 83, 89. His BP steadied. The visible strain in his neck muscles eased. The room went completely quiet. Hannah stepped back, held the needle, and looked at Dr. Lang. His face had gone through several colors in about 4 seconds. Surprise, confusion, and then something that settled into a hard, cold fury. "What," he said, very quietly, "did you just do?" Emergency needle decompression. Tension pneumothorax was imminent. He was going to arrest before the X-ray was processed. "You performed an invasive procedure on my patient without my authorization." "Yes." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Lang looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. He looked at the saturation reading, 92 and still climbing, and his jaw tightened in a way that told Hannah he understood exactly what had just happened and was not going to acknowledge it. "Security," he said. "Dr. Lang, I want this nurse removed from my trauma bay." He still wasn't looking at the monitors. He was looking at Hannah, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had just been made to feel small in front of his team and was going to make someone pay for it. "Now!" Dolores appeared at the bay entrance, her face tight with something that was half alarm and half apology. She met Hannah's eyes and looked away. 2 security officers arrived inside of 2 minutes. Hannah didn't resist. She had known, even as she reached for the needle, that this was one of the possible outcomes. She had done the math on that too, and the math had been straightforward. The patient's life was worth her job. She had made that trade before. She picked up her personal items from her locker in 4 minutes, signed nothing, said nothing to the charge nurse who stood in the hallway with her arms crossed and her eyes somewhere else. She pushed through the back exit and walked into the night, and the rain hit her immediately, cold and sharp and indifferent, and she stood in it for a moment with her hands in her jacket pockets and her face turned up toward the sky. She was 34 years old. She had survived 2 overseas deployments. She had treated blast injuries, crush injuries, hemorrhagic shock, traumatic amputations, and every other variety of catastrophic damage the human body could sustain. She had worked for 4 months in a combat hospital where she went 40 hours without sleeping. She had held soldiers together with her hands while waiting for a medevac that was always 30 minutes out. She had been fired by a man who couldn't read a chest. She walked to her car. She sat in the driver's seat and didn't start the engine. The rain on the windshield blurred the parking lot lights into something that looked almost abstract, orange and white smearing across the glass, and she breathed in and out and told herself this was fixable. She would file a complaint with the medical board. She would request the patient records. She had witnesses, even if none of them had said a word. She was still telling herself all of this when she heard it. A sound that was not thunder, not a truck, not anything that belonged in a hospital parking lot at 2:30 in the morning. It was a heavy military rotor, close, getting closer. She looked through the rain-blurred windshield toward the hospital roof. The running lights appeared first, red and green through the low clouds, and then the Black Hawk dropped into view above the roofline, its searchlight cutting a white column through the dark, its rotor wash scattering the rain in every direction. It was a military aircraft, fully rigged, coming down with the kind of controlled speed that told her whoever was flying it had done this 1,000 times. She was out of her car before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Inside the ER, she could see through the glass doors that the waiting room had gone still, patients standing, staff pressed toward windows, two nurses with their phones out. She watched the security desk scramble. She watched someone on the intercom. The Black Hawk touched down on the rooftop pad, and 4 minutes later the elevator opened and 4 people walked into the emergency department. Not in scrubs, not in suits. In full tactical gear, sidearms visible, with the kind of deliberate movement that cleared a path without requiring anyone to say "excuse me." At the front was a man in his 50s with the general's stars on his collar and the kind of face that had spent a long time making decisions in bad conditions. Not hard, exactly, but settled, calibrated. The face of someone who had learned a long time ago not to waste expression on things that didn't require it. He walked to the nurse's station and he spoke to the charge nurse, and whatever he said made her pick up a phone with shaking hands. Hannah was standing at the glass doors. She couldn't hear the words, but she watched the charge nurse point toward the trauma bay, watched the general nod once, watched the team move in that direction with the kind of coordinated efficiency that she had not seen since she got out. And then she watched the charge nurse say something else, something that made the general stop and turn. He was looking at the exit, at the doors where she was standing. He said something to the nurse again, and this time Hannah saw it clearly. Saw the nurse's face register something between confusion and alarm, saw her reach for the intercom. The speakers crackled. "Hannah Brooks to the emergency department. Hannah Brooks." She hadn't moved. She was already there. She was standing at the glass with the rain on her jacket, and her badge gone, and her hands perfectly still at her sides. And she was looking at a U.S. Army general who had just gotten off a Black Hawk in the middle of the night, asking for her. Her hand hit the door sensor. She walked back in. The general met her 10 feet inside the entrance. He stopped. He looked at her for a moment with the same calibrated expression, reading her the way people with field experience read each other, fast and specific and without ceremony. "Captain Brooks," he said. Not nurse. Not Ms. Captain. She hadn't heard that word in 2 years. "I'm not active duty," she said. Her voice came out level. "Sir?" "Not yet." He extended a hand. "General Elias Mercer, Army Special Operations Command. I need you to come with me." "Can I ask why?" "The patient your surgeon was treating." He paused one beat. "He's one of ours. And the first thing he said when he started coming around was your name." The trauma bay was 15 meters away. Through the open door, she could see the monitor. SATs holding in the mid-90s now, BP stable, the patient breathing without the visible distress of a chest that was destroying itself from the inside. She could see the back of Dr. Long's head as he stood over the patient, and she could see the moment he registered the military team's presence. His posture shifted, a small, careful adjustment, the kind of recalibration a person makes when they suddenly realize the room has changed around them. Hannah looked at the general. "Lead the way," she said. She followed him into the bay and stood at the edge of the team while one of the tactical personnel plugged a small encrypted device into the trauma room's monitor port, and a second one began speaking quietly into a radio. The patient on the table, the man she had kept alive 20 minutes ago, had a BP cuff cycling every 30 seconds and an IV running wide open. His color was better. His breathing was better. He was not, she noticed, anyone she had ever seen before. But he had said her name. She stood there in her wet jacket, badgeless, fired, technically not supposed to be in this hospital, watching a U.S. Army general direct his team through a situation she still didn't fully understand, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. The quiet, specific alertness of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Dr. Lang appeared at her elbow. "You're not authorized to be in this bay," he said, low and tight, clearly recalibrated but not recalculated. "You were removed from this hospital. I'm calling security again." "Dr. Lang!" General Mercer's voice came from across the room without him looking up from what he was doing. It was not a raised voice. It was the voice of a man who did not need volume. "That will not be necessary." Lang went very still. "This nurse saved your patient's life tonight," Mercer continued, quiet and absolute. And based on the footage I've already reviewed from this bay, she did it in approximately 90 seconds while you were preparing equipment for a procedure that would have arrived 7 minutes too late. He looked up then, at Lang, directly, briefly. So, she stays. The room had the kind of silence that forms after a certain type of detonation. Hannah didn't look at Lang. She was looking at the patient. His eyes had opened. They were dark, slightly unfocused, moving through the ceiling the way eyes do when consciousness is returning from somewhere far away, slow and incremental and fighting its own weight. He was trying to orient. She could see it in the small movements of his hands against the table. The micro-frown as sensation registered, and then his gaze found her face, and something in it sharpened. "Brooks," he said. Just that. Rough and quiet, barely enough air behind it. She moved to the bedside. "Don't try to talk," she said. You're stable. You're in a hospital in Dunmore, Colorado. You're okay." His hand moved toward her wrist, not grabbing, just making contact, fingers against her pulse point the way a person checks that something is real. "You came back," he said. She had no idea what he meant. She also had no idea who he was. But something about the way he said it, the weight behind it, the specific relief, made her stay perfectly still and not correct him. General Murr had moved to stand on the opposite side of the bed. He was watching the patient's face with the attentive neutrality of a man assessing a situation, and then he looked at Hannah. "He's been talking about you since they loaded him," Mercer said. "In and out. He knew your name, your rank, your unit designation from an overseas deployment." He paused. "Does the name Mason Holt mean anything to you?" The trauma bay was very quiet. Hannah looked at the patient, at the set of his jaw, at the particular thickness of his forearms, at a pale surgical scar that ran along his left collarbone in a direction that wasn't consistent with any civilian injury she could think of. And she went back through her memory with the focused attention of someone who had never let go of anything that mattered. A field hospital, a firefight that lasted 2 days, a soldier with a thoracic injury and no time in her hands and whatever she could reach. She looked at the scar, at the face under all the gray. "Sergeant Holt," she said slowly, "Kandahar, 2019. He made a sound that was almost a laugh and cost him about half the air in his lungs. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "and it's Command Sergeant Major now." He paused, breathing carefully. "You still do everything the hard way." She had saved his life once before, in a tent with a dirt floor and no imaging, and she hadn't known what happened to him afterward. Soldiers she treated in the field disappeared into the system, medevaced out, reassigned, rotated home. You learn not to follow up because the following up could break you. You just did the job and let the work be enough. He'd remembered her name for 5 years. She had remembered a scar. "I need someone to explain to me," said Dr. Victor Lang from the far side of the bay, his voice carrying the tension of a man trying to recover authority from a room that had already moved on without him. "What exactly is happening in my trauma bay?" General Mercer turned. The look on his face was not anger. It was something more measured and considerably more permanent. "Your trauma bay," he said, "is currently a federal scene." He gestured to the 2 tactical personnel who had been working quietly in the background. "We'll need all footage from this room from the last 90 minutes. We'll also need to speak with your administrator on call and your chief medical officer. It's 2:30 in the morning. I'm aware of the time." Lang's mouth opened, closed. He looked at Hannah with something that had moved past fury into a colder register. The look of a man who had begun doing rapid arithmetic about the next several hours and didn't like the numbers. "This is not standard protocol for a GSW patient," he said. "Even if the patient has military affiliation, Command Sergeant Major Holt is not simply a GSW patient." Mercer's voice didn't shift, didn't harden, didn't need to. "He is a classified asset. This scene is now under Army jurisdiction, and every action taken in this room tonight is being reviewed." He paused. "Every action." Hannah watched Lang's left hand tighten against the trauma table. She had spent 2 years making herself small in this hospital. 2 years stepping back, not finishing sentences, swallowing the things she knew. She had told herself it was practical, that she needed the job, needed the steady paycheck, needed the simple routine of a civilian career after the grinding intensity of everything before it. She had told herself she was protecting herself from confrontation, But standing here now, in her wet jacket, in the bay she'd been walked out of 40 minutes ago, watching a general review footage on an encrypted tablet while the man who had fired her went pale at the edge of the room, she was starting to think that what she had actually been doing was waiting. Not consciously, not with any plan attached to it. But some part of her had known that a building built on that kind of arrogance was never going to hold indefinitely. That eventually, something would crack it open. She hadn't planned on being the one to do it. She also hadn't planned on Mason Holt bleeding out on a table in Dunmore, Colorado, at 2 in the morning. Plans, she had learned a long time ago, were just the things you thought about in the intervals between what actually happened. General Mercer held the tablet out to her. On the screen was a freeze frame of the Trauma Bay footage, time-stamped 2:17:43 a.m., the image clear enough to show the needle in her hand, the exact position of her placement, the monitor behind her displaying the patient's rising saturation. "Walk me through this," he said. She took the tablet. She walked him through it. She was precise and clinical and unhurried, the way she had been trained to report in the field. No hedging, no softening, no apology built into the framing. She told him what she'd observed, what she'd assessed, what she'd estimated about the time remaining, and why she made the call she made. She told him about Lang's response and his instruction to security. Mercer listened without interrupting. When she finished, he took the tablet back and looked at it for a moment. "And where did you learn emergency needle decompression?" he asked. Not skeptically, procedurally. "Army Combat Medic Course, Fort Sam, Houston, 2017. Applied in field conditions 4 times between 2017 and 2021. She paused. "Twice successfully, once with complications, once on a patient who didn't make it regardless." Mercer nodded once. "What happened to the ones who didn't make it?" he asked. It was, she realized, a character question as much as a clinical one. He wanted to know if she carried it. "I carry them," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned back toward the room. "Get me hospital administration," he said to one of his team, "and pull everything you can on the last 6 hours of activity in this bay." Hannah stood at Mason Holt's bedside and watched him breathe. Even, steady, the slow, measured respiration of a body fighting its way back from the edge. And she listened to the general's team work through the room with the quiet efficiency of people who did this in much worse conditions. And in the back of her mind, under everything else, a single question had started to form. Mason Holt had been brought here without identification. No tags, no paperwork, nothing that connected him to the Army or to a unit or to any official context. A classified asset, the general had said. That meant someone had been careful about moving him, careful in a way that went beyond normal operational security, which meant someone had known he was coming, which meant whoever had treated him tonight, whoever had delayed his treatment, whoever had ignored the deteriorating vitals and ordered a chest film when there was no time for a chest film, had done so either through catastrophic incompetence or something else. Hannah looked at the freeze frame on the general's tablet, which was still visible from where she stood. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at the clock on the wall. She did the math for the 3rd time that night, and this time the numbers added up to something that had nothing to do with medicine. At the nurse's station, Lang had his phone to his ear. He was turned away from the bay, speaking in a low, controlled voice, his free hand pressed flat against the counter. His posture had the careful neutrality of a man trying very hard not to look like he was doing anything significant. Hannah watched him. The tactical officer nearest to the door, a woman with the efficient economy of movement that Hannah recognized from her own unit years back, had also turned slightly in Lang's direction. Their eyes met for 1 second. The officer looked away and said something quietly into her radio. The rain outside had not let up. Somewhere above them, the Blackhawk sat on the roof with its rotors powered down, waiting. Mason Holt breathed in the bed beside her. The monitor cycled through its steady rhythm. Heart rate, saturation, blood pressure, and all the numbers held. And Dr. Victor Lang, still on his phone at the nurse's station, did not know yet that the cameras in this hallway had been recording since 10:47 p.m., that the encrypted drive the tactical team had plugged into the monitor port had been pulling metadata from the hospital's entire surveillance system for the last 11 minutes, or that the woman he'd had walked out of this building in the rain was standing 20 feet away, watching him with the same quiet, specific attention she'd once used to watch a perimeter in the dark. She had been invisible in this hospital for 2 years. She was not invisible anymore. Dr. Victor Lang ended the call the same way a person closes a door they're hoping no one noticed they opened, carefully, with both hands, his body angled just slightly away from the rest of the room. Hannah watched him pocket the phone and turn back toward the nurse's station with an expression that had been reconstructed in the 30 seconds he'd spent with his back to the bay. He looked composed, professionally neutral, the face of a man who had just handled something routine. She had spent 4 years reading people in conditions where reading them wrong got someone killed. She knew the difference between calm and performed calm, and what Lang was wearing on his face right now had been assembled, not arrived at. She filed it and said nothing. The tactical officer near the door, the one whose eyes she'd caught for a single second, had already moved. Not obviously. She hadn't walked toward Lang or reached for anything. She had simply repositioned herself 6 feet to the left, which put her in clear line of sight of the nurse's station, and resumed looking at her tablet with the focused patience of someone who had learned a long time ago how to watch without appearing to watch. General Mercer was at Mason Holt's bedside, reviewing the patient's chart on his encrypted device, when one of his team materialized at his shoulder and said something too quietly for Hannah to catch. Mercer's expression didn't change, but his hand stilled on the device for 1 beat, and then he said, "Pull the full system log, everything since 2000 hours." And his team member moved away without a word. Mason was awake, but managing it carefully. The kind of careful that told Hannah he'd been hurt badly enough to know that moving wrong would cost him. His color was better than it had been. His breathing had evened out. But there was a grayness under his skin that wasn't going anywhere quickly, and the way his jaw tightened every time he inhaled past a certain depth told her the decompression had bought time but not solved everything. "You need to stay still," she told him. "I am still." "Your hand is on the bedrail." He looked down, relaxed his grip, slowly, like a man acknowledging a point he didn't want to concede. "I'm not going to fall off the table." "Nobody said you were. I said stay still." He made a sound that was almost insubordination and then did what she said, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way she didn't allow to become anything further. She had always had a problem with patients who thought cooperation was optional. Mason Holt, 5 years later, in a completely different state, in a completely different context, was apparently still one of those patients. Some things were consistent. She did a quick secondary assessment while she had him. Not official, not charted, just her hands and her eyes doing what they did automatically. Pulse at the wrist, slightly elevated but not alarming. Skin temperature, the quality of his breathing at full expansion. She put 2 fingers to the left lateral chest wall, felt what she was looking for, and told him to breathe in slowly. He did. "Hurt?" she asked. "Yes." "Same place or different?" "Both." She noted that. There was still fluid accumulation somewhere in that chest that hadn't been on the film because they hadn't gotten a film yet, because Lang had been setting up for an intubation that was never going to work. She needed imaging. She needed it now, not in the morning, and she was technically not on staff, and the attending who had replaced her paperwork-wise was currently standing at a nurse's station in the middle of whatever he was in the middle of. She turned toward Mercer. "He needs a chest CT," she said. "Now, not in an hour." Mercer looked at her. "There's fluid in the left hemithorax that the decompression didn't clear. Could be a hemothorax developing. Could be blood from the penetrating wound tracking into the pleural space. Either way, I'm not comfortable waiting until he's officially admitted and the night attending gets around to ordering imaging." "Then order it," Mercer said. "I'm not currently on staff." "Captain Brooks." His voice was patient and precise. "I outrank every person in this building. Order the CT." She looked at him for 1 second, then turned to the nearest nurse, a young man named Derek, who had been standing at the edge of the bay with the careful stillness of someone trying not to get hit by whatever was flying through the room. "Derek, I need a portable chest CT request put through. Emergent priority, left hemithorax, possible hemothorax or pleural effusion." Derek looked at the general. Mercer nodded once. Derek reached for the phone. From the nurse's station, Lang's voice cut across the bay. "No imaging orders go through without my authorization." The room didn't exactly freeze. It was more that everyone in it performed the specific stillness of people who had just heard something land and were waiting to see how large the crater was going to be. General Mercer turned slowly from the bedside. Dr. Lang, he said, I'm going to ask you to step away from the nurses' station. This is my department. I understand you believe that. Mercer moved toward him, unhurried, and something about the quality of his movement, not aggressive, just completely without deference, made Lang's next sentence die before it reached the air. But I've now reviewed 47 minutes of your department's footage from tonight, and I have significant questions about the timeline of treatment decisions made in this bay. Until those questions are answered, I'd prefer you limit your communications and your directives to nothing that isn't directly necessary for patient care. He stopped 6 feet from Lang and held his gaze. The CT will be ordered. Do you have a patient care objection to that? A long beat. No, Lang said. Good. Derek was already on the phone. Hannah turned back to Mason. He had been watching the exchange with the careful attentiveness of someone tracking a tactical situation from a fixed position, processing, calculating, his eyes moving between Mercer and Lang and back with a precision that told her he was in considerably better shape cognitively than the blood pressure reading suggested he should be. You fired already? He asked her, low. They walked me out at 2:14. And you came back in. The general asked me to. He considered this. He was going to ask. I told him to find you before he found me. His voice was rough and economical. No extra air spent on words that weren't doing work. Figured the ER would have you. Didn't figure they'd have already cleared you out. She looked at him. You told him to find me. You're the only person I've ever personally watched decompress a tension pneumo with a 14 gauge in the dark with incoming fire. He paused, his jaw tightening around a breath that cost more than he showed. Figured if anyone was going to do it again in a Colorado hospital, it would be you. She had approximately 40 follow-up questions and the clinical discipline to ask none of them. We'll talk when you're stable, she said. I'm stable now. You have fluid in your chest. I've had worse. I know, she said. That's not actually reassuring. The CT request went through. Derek came back to report a 20-minute wait on the portable unit, which was 3 rooms down, finishing a head series on a stroke patient. Hannah told him fine, told him to notify her the moment it was free, and then crossed the bay to where Mercer's second team member, a stocky man with a tablet and a headset who had been working steadily in the corner since they arrived, was pulling data off the hospital's network with the focused efficiency of a person who did not need anyone's help and did not want anyone's conversation. What are you finding? She asked him. He looked at her, looked at Mercer. Mercer gave him a small nod. Surveillance metadata, he said. Access logs, door swipes, communication records from the hospital's internal network. He turned the tablet so she could see the screen. Specifically, I'm looking at the activity pattern in this bay from the time Sergeant Major Holt arrived until the time your general walked in. He scrolled through a column of timestamps with a stylus. Standard stuff for the first 6 minutes. Then here, he tapped a point in the log. This is where it gets interesting. She looked at the timestamp, 2:09 a.m., 4 minutes before she decompressed the chest. That's a network access record from a terminal in this bay, the analyst said. Someone logged into the patient record system from inside this room, pulled the incoming patient's pre-arrival EMS report, and 3 minutes later, at 2:12, made an outbound call from the desk extension to an unregistered number. Hannah felt something settle cold and specific in her chest. Who logged in? She asked. The analyst pulled up the credential record. Lang v. MD, attending access. The call lasted 48 seconds, the analyst said. Desk extension 2:12 a.m. We don't have the audio yet, but we have the recipient number and we're running it. She straightened up and looked across the room to where Lang was now sitting in a rolling chair at the far edge of the nurse's station. His posture arranged into something that was supposed to look like cooperative patience and looked instead like a man consciously managing what his body was doing. She did not look at him long enough to signal that she was looking. She went back to Mason's bedside and checked his saturation, 94 holding, and his BP, which had come up to 91/62, better, but not where it needed to be. The IV was running. The monitors were cycling. The immediate crisis was contained. What was not contained was everything outside the immediate crisis. She was thinking about the timeline. EMS had called the incoming report at 2:03 a.m. That was standard. Paramedics radio ahead. Nursing staff prepares the bay, gets the trauma team moving. The bay would have been notified of the GSW patient 7, maybe 8 minutes before the gurney came through the doors. Lang had logged into the record system at 2:09 a.m. and pulled the pre-arrival report. That was not unusual on its own. Attendings reviewed incoming patient data all the time. The outbound call at 2:12 a.m., 3 minutes after he'd seen the patient details, to an unregistered number lasting 48 seconds. That was not standard. That was not anything close to standard. And then at 2:14 a.m., the patient arrived, and Lang had been unhurried in a situation that called for urgency. He had called for imaging when imaging would cost time. He had instructed her to step back. He had not, she realized now with the cold clarity of hindsight, appeared particularly alarmed when the patient's saturation started dropping. She thought about a man with no identification, transported to a regional hospital in the middle of the night, who was apparently classified enough to warrant a Black Hawk and a 4-person tactical team. She thought about who might want that man to not survive the next hour. She thought about a 48-second phone call. The CT unit arrived outside the bay at 2:58 a.m., pushed by a technician who looked like she'd been asleep 20 minutes ago and was still making the transition. Hannah moved to coordinate the transfer, directing Mason's lines and monitoring equipment with the practiced efficiency of someone who had moved critical patients in environments where a knocked IV line meant starting over with supplies you didn't have. Mason bore the repositioning without complaint, which told her it hurt more than he was showing, because Mason Holt complaining was apparently not something that happened. The images took 11 minutes. Hannah stood at the portable display monitor while they processed and watched the slices appear. Lung fields, mediastinum, pleural spaces. And there it was, exactly where she'd expected it. A moderate hemothorax on the left, blood pooling in the pleural space, not immediately life-threatening at current volume, but actively accumulating. The penetrating wound had nicked something small, not a major vessel, or he'd have been unsalvageable. But small vessels bled reliably if you gave them time, and time was the one thing nobody in this room had been managing well tonight. She needed a thoracic surgeon, not Long. Long's operating privileges were, as far as she was concerned, suspended pending whatever the general's team was building. But a real thoracic surgeon called in, woken up, brought in from home if necessary. She went to Mercer. He needs a chest tube and probable surgical intervention for a developing hemothorax, she said. Who do you want handling it? I can identify the best thoracic surgeon on this hospital's roster, but I'd recommend an external resource if you have one, given the circumstances. Mercer didn't hesitate. We have a surgical team on standby at Fort Graves, 40 minutes by air. That's 40 minutes he'll spend bleeding. Can you stabilize him for 40 minutes? She looked at the CT image on the monitor, looked at the rate of accumulation she could estimate from the film, looked at Mason's current pressure and what the trajectory told her. 40 minutes is manageable if nothing changes, she said. If the bleed accelerates, it isn't. Then keep it from accelerating. That's not how bleeding works. I know how bleeding works, Captain. I'm asking what you need. She told him. Blood products, specific lines, a crash cart position closer than it currently was. She told him she needed the thoracic tray from surgical supply in case the Fort Graves team's timeline slipped. She told him she needed someone to get the hospital's chief of thoracics on the phone and brief them, not to operate but to be available. He made 3 calls in the time it took her to get back to Mason's bedside. She spent the next 22 minutes running the kind of ongoing assessment that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Vital signs every 3 minutes, breath sounds every 5. Watching the subtleties of his respiration and color and capillary refill with the same attention she'd have given to a patient in a forward operating base where the nearest backup was an hour away. This was what field medicine actually looked like. Not the adrenaline and the decisive moment. Those were real, but they were brief. The rest of it was watching and thinking and doing the calculation over and over and being honest with yourself when the numbers changed. Mason watched her watch him. He had the quality of stillness that very experienced soldiers developed, not the passivity of someone who'd given up managing their situation, but the deliberate conservation of a person who understood that energy spent on the wrong thing was energy not available for the right thing. Talk to me, he said at one point. Not a request exactly, more like an instruction. About what? Anything. I'm going to fall asleep if nobody talks. Falling asleep is fine. Your brain doesn't need to stay conscious right now. I need to stay conscious. You're not on a mission, Sergeant Major. I'm always on a mission. A pause. How long have you been at this hospital? 2 years. Why here? She didn't answer immediately because the honest answer was complicated, and the simple answer was going to sound like something she didn't want to put words to right now. It was available, she said finally. He made a sound that was not quite skepticism. You went from combat medicine to overnight nursing at a regional hospital in Dunmore, Colorado. Lots of people transition. Not you. She checked his saturation, 93. You don't know me that well. I spent 6 weeks recovering from what you did in that tent, he said. I had a lot of time to think about the person who'd done it. He breathed carefully. You're good at hiding. She was quiet for a moment. Most people don't notice they need to look, she said. He accepted that. At 3:31 a.m., Mercer's analyst stood up from the corner workstation and said, General, I've got the number. The room's attention shifted without anyone making a visible movement. Mercer crossed to him. The analyst turned the tablet so Mercer could see the screen, said something in a low voice, and watched the general's expression process whatever was on it. The processing was brief. Mercer's face did what faces like his did, absorbed it, filed it, moved forward. He turned to the tactical officer near the door. Get Halverson on the line. Tell him we need a records warrant for this number and everything attached to it. Patient records, billing, any communications that touched this network in the last 18 months. The officer was already on her radio. Hannah was watching Lang. He was still in the rolling chair, still arranged into patients, but something had changed in the last 3 minutes. A slight rigidity in his shoulders, a quality of attention that was slightly too controlled, like someone maintaining a posture through effort rather than relaxation. He had not looked at the analyst since the man stood up. He was looking at his own hands. She thought about the 48-second call. She thought about what you could say in 48 seconds if you already knew what you needed to say and the other person already knew what they needed to hear. Not much. A name, a status update, a warning. Mercer moved to the center of the room and said, without raising his voice, Dr. Lang, I'm going to ask you to come with me. Lang looked up. The performance of calm had become visibly effortful. I'm sorry? There are some questions I'd like you to answer in a more private setting. I think I'd like to speak with my attorney first. The room absorbed that sentence. It was, Hannah thought, an interesting choice of words. Not what questions. Not the response of a man who was confused and wanted clarification. Straight to attorney. The response of someone who already knew what the questions were going to be. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. That's your right, he said. However, I want to be very clear about something. He stepped closer, not in a way that was physically intimidating. He didn't need that, but in the way of a man making sure every syllable landed where he intended it to. The Army has jurisdiction over this patient and this scene. Federal investigators have been notified and are currently en route. The surveillance footage from this bay, your network access records, and your outbound communications from 2:12 a.m. are already in federal custody. He paused. So while you absolutely may speak with an attorney, I'd encourage you to consider that the things we're going to ask you about are things we already have documentation for. The only variable at this point is your cooperation. Lang's jaw moved. He said nothing. One of the tactical team members appeared at his shoulder, not touching him, just present. And Lang stood slowly, like a man who had made a decision he was not fully at peace with, and followed Mercer toward the consultation room off the main bay corridor. The door closed. Hannah turned back to Mason. His pressure was writing 94/65, up slightly, which was good. His breath sounds on the left were unchanged, which meant the hemothorax was not accelerating, which meant they had time. Derek appeared at her elbow. The Fort Graves surgical team is 22 minutes out, he said. They radioed ahead. 2 surgeons, 1 anesthesiologist, full thoracic kit. Good. Tell them we have a developing left hemothorax, current volume moderate, stable for now. BP trends improving. Patient is conscious and alert. She looked at Mason, who was listening to everything. More or less. More or less, Mason said. You look tired. I'm fine. You have blood in your chest. I've had blood in my... I know. She looked at him directly. Please stop telling me you've had worse. I can see your chart and I believe you. It's not making me feel better about the next 20 minutes. He was quiet for a beat. Sorry, he said. It was a real apology. quick and unelaborated, the kind that didn't try to dress itself up into something larger. She appreciated it more than she'd have expected. The consultation room door was visible from where she stood, closed. Whatever was happening inside it was happening without her, which was fine. Her job was the 11 feet of space around this bed, and she was doing it. She was doing a final check on Mason's IV lines when Derek's voice came again from behind her, tighter this time. Hannah. Not Nurse Brooks. Hannah. The kind of first name usage that meant something had changed. The system just flagged something. She turned. Derek had a printed readout in his hand, paper from the nurse's station printer, which meant it had come directly off the hospital's internal alert system. He held it toward her, and his face was doing something she hadn't seen on it before in 2 years of working alongside him. It was the face of someone who had just read something they wished they hadn't. She took the printout. It was a network alert, auto-generated by the hospital's pharmacy management system, flagging an unusual access pattern in the medication dispensing records. Specifically, 3 separate access events in the last 4 hours, all from an administrative terminal on the 3rd floor, pulling dosage records for a class of drugs that had no business appearing together in any clinical context she could think of. Potassium chloride, vecuronium, and a specific anticoagulant at a dose range that, combined with the first 2, would be undetectable in a post-mortem talk screen in a patient presenting with traumatic injury. She read it twice. She looked at Mason Holt. She looked at the consultation room door. She said very quietly to Derek, "Who else has seen this?" "Just me. Just now. The system generated it about 4 minutes ago. It flags unusual multi-drug access patterns after hours." "Who has access to the 3rd floor administrative terminal?" Derek's face answered before his mouth did. "Senior medical staff," he said, "and administration." She was already moving toward the consultation room. She hit the door with one knock and pushed it open without waiting, and Mercer looked up from across the table where Lang was sitting with his hands flat in front of him and the expression of a man who had been counting very carefully on something. "General," she said. She held out the printout. Mercer took it. He read it. The room had a quality of silence that was different from the one before, denser, the kind that forms when something stops being theoretical. Mercer looked at Lang, and Lang looked at Hannah, and in that look, that single, specific, unguarded second before his face recomposed itself into whatever it was going to be next, she saw it clearly, not surprise, not confusion, not the shock of a man confronted with something he didn't know about. He had known. He had been waiting to find out how quickly they would find it. Mercer set the printout on the table between them with the slow, deliberate placement of a man laying down evidence in a room that had just become a very different kind of room. "I think," he said, "we're going to need to talk about a few more things." Lang's hand moved to his jacket pocket. It was a reflex, small and fast and immediately controlled, but Hannah had been watching his hands for the last 40 minutes, and she caught it. "His pocket," she said. The tactical officer was already there. The tactical officer's hand closed around Lang's wrist before he got the pocket open. It was clean and fast and not rough, the practiced restraint of someone trained to contain rather than escalate. And Lang didn't fight it, which told Hannah something. A man with nothing in his pocket fights that kind of contact instinctively. A man who knows what's in his pocket does the math first. Lang did the math. He went still. "Slowly," the officer said. His fingers came out of the pocket holding a phone. Not the hospital-issued phone he'd been using at the nurse's station. A personal cell, but older model, the kind people used when they didn't want carrier records attached to anything that mattered. A burner, or close enough to one. The officer took it with 2 fingers and placed it on the table in front of Mercer without breaking her grip on Lang's wrist. Mercer looked at the phone, looked at Lang. "Who were you calling?" he asked. Lang had arrived at a decision somewhere in the last 30 seconds. Hannah could see it in the quality of his stillness, the way his breathing had changed, the specific flatness that settled over his face like a shutter coming down. He had decided to stop performing. "I'd like my attorney," he said. "You said that already." "And I'll keep saying it." Mercer picked up the burner phone with a gloved hand. One of his team had produced gloves without being asked, and handed it to the analyst who had appeared in the doorway behind Hannah. "Full extraction. Everything on it." The analyst took it and was gone. Hannah was still holding the pharmacy printout. She looked at it one more time and then put it on the table next to the spot where the phone had been, because it belonged in the same visual field as everything else this man had done tonight. "I need to get back to the patient," she told Mercer. He nodded once. She pulled the consultation room door shut behind her and walked back into the bay and stood at Mason's bedside and felt the particular come down of an acute moment passing. The way the body returns from high alert, not in a rush, but in increments, the shoulders dropping a half-inch, the breathing finding a slightly lower gear. She had been running on compressed attention for the last hour and a half, and her body was beginning to register that it had opinions about this. She ignored those opinions and checked Mason's vitals. BP 96/68, better. Saturation 94. Holding. Respiratory rate 18, even. She put her stethoscope to his left chest and listened. The breath sounds were diminished, but not significantly worse than the last assessment. The hemothorax was not accelerating or not at a rate she could detect clinically. The Fort Graves team was, she checked the clock, 12 minutes out. "What happened in there?" Mason asked. Lang had a second phone. A pause. "Personal?" "Unregistered." He reached for it when the general put the pharmacy printout in front of him. Mason absorbed this with the economy of a man used to receiving information that was worse than he'd hoped for and managing it without making it someone else's problem. His eyes moved to the ceiling and then back to her face. "The drug's on the printout. Someone accessed records for a combination that has no clinical application in this patient's care. A combination that would work on a trauma patient." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The monitor beeped steadily. Somewhere down the corridor, a phone rang and was answered on the second ring. "How many people on this floor had access to that terminal?" he asked. "Derek's getting me that list." "Good." He shifted slightly and controlled the resulting expression with the practiced restraint of someone who had trained himself not to show pain to people who might act on it by making him stop doing things. "You know what this means?" "I know what it might mean." "Hannah?" His voice had changed, not softer, but more direct, the way it had been in the tent in Kandahar when he'd needed her to hear him through the noise, and she'd needed him to stop moving. "Somebody in this hospital knew I was coming before I arrived. Somebody pulled my pre-arrival report, made a call, and then somebody else accessed pharmaceutical records for a drug combination that would have killed me and looked like a complication from the wound." He held her gaze. "That's not one person acting alone." She knew that. She had known it since she saw the access log timestamps and started counting backward through the sequence of decisions that had been made in this bay tonight. The delay in treatment, the resistance to her assessment, the specific drugs accessed, the specific timing of the call. It had too many moving parts to be improvisation. "The general's team is already pulling communications records," she said. "They'll find it." "They'll find the edges of it," Mason said. "The middle is going to take longer." He breathed carefully. "In the meantime, I need you to understand that anyone connected to whatever this is may still be in this building." "I understand that." "Do you have any way to—" "I've been paying attention since they walked me back in," she said. "I know who's moved where. I know who's made calls. I know who's been too still and who's been too busy and who's done exactly what you'd expect." She looked at him. "I'm not new at this." A beat. "No," he said. "You're not." Derek appeared with a printed sheet, the terminal access list, and she scanned it fast. 12 names, senior medical staff and administrative personnel, as he'd said. Of the 12, 4 were currently in the building on active shifts. She compared those 4 names against the mental map she'd been building since 2:15 a.m. 3 of the 4 she could account for. She'd seen them, tracked their movements. They'd behaved in ways that were consistent with people who'd had a strange night but weren't managing a secret. The 4th was the overnight hospital administrator, a man named Roland Prisk, whose office was on the 3rd floor, and who, according to Derek, had been paged at 2:08 a.m., 1 minute before Lang's access log entry, and had signed in on the 3rd floor terminal at 2:09 a.m., at which point Lang had pulled the patient report. 2 people, 1 minute apart, same timestamp. "Derek," she said, "where is Roland Prisk right now?" Derek looked at the board. 3rd floor. He hasn't come down since he was paged. She turned to the tactical officer who had remained in the bay after the consultation room. "I need you to make sure Roland Prisk, the overnight administrator on 3, doesn't leave the building." The officer looked at the bay door and back to Hannah, and then made a call on her radio with the clipped efficiency that meant she'd already been thinking the same thing and was glad someone had said it out loud. The Fort Graves surgical team arrived at 3:47 a.m., not by helicopter this time, but by vehicle. They'd been close enough to drive once Mercer's people had arranged a ground corridor. Two surgeons named Vasquez and Okafor, an anesthesiologist and a scrub tech, all moving with the compressed urgency of people who had been given a patient profile in transit and had already made their decisions before they walked through the door. Hannah gave them the handoff in 90 seconds. Mechanism of injury, vitals trend, decompression timeline, CT findings, current bleed estimate, IV access, blood products running. Vasquez, the senior surgeon, a compact woman with gray-streaked hair who listened with her eyes on the patient and not on the person talking, asked two clarifying questions, both precise, and then nodded. "Good catch on the hemothorax," she said to Hannah. "It was on the film." "Films don't read themselves." Vasquez was already moving to Mason's bedside, pulling on gloves. "We'll take him from here. Chest tube first. OR if the bleed doesn't respond." Hannah stepped back, not because she was done, but because this was the right handoff point. This was where her specific job ended and theirs began, and knowing the boundary was part of doing the work well. She moved to the edge of the bay and watched them set up with the practiced efficiency of a team that had done this in worse lighting, worse conditions, worse situations. Mason looked at her from across the bay as the Fort Graves team moved around him. She couldn't hear what they were saying to him, but he held her gaze for 1 second and gave her a small nod. Not a thank you, or not only that. The kind of nod that means I see what you did, and I'm not going to forget it, which from a man like Mason Holt was the equivalent of a speech. She looked away first. Too much to do. Mercer emerged from the consultation room at 3:52 a.m., and the quality of his movement had changed, slightly faster, more directed, the shift from investigation to response. He crossed the bay to Hannah without stopping to talk to anyone else. "Lang made 4 calls on the burner phone tonight," he said, "all after 2,200 hours. My analyst is still pulling the full record, but we've already matched 2 of the numbers to a known network." "Known to whom?" "To an ongoing federal counterintelligence investigation that has been running for 14 months. He said it matter-of-factly, the way people in his position delivered information that would sound extraordinary to anyone who hadn't spent time in the specific geography of operational security. Crestview Regional Medical Center has been a peripheral data point in that investigation for the last 4 months. Patient records, billing irregularities, a communication pattern that kept appearing in trace data without a clear source." He looked at her. Tonight clarified the source. She processed this. Lang was inside the network. Lang was a node. We don't yet know how large the node is. A pause. "Which brings me to Prisk. 3rd floor. I had the tactical officer flag him." Mercer's expression shifted by a fraction. Not surprise, more the specific satisfaction of confirmation. "He's been in contact with the same network. Different channel, different frequency, but the pattern matches. We're getting the warrant for his communications now." He glanced toward the elevator bank. "I want to speak with him before federal agents arrive and he lawyers up. But I want someone with me who knows this building's personnel." "Derek knows it better than I do." "Derek is 26 years old, and this is the most frightening night of his career." Mercer looked at her. "I need someone who won't be intimidated by what Prisk is going to say when we walk in." She understood. She also understood that she had been technically fired from this hospital for 3.5 hours, and had no standing to be on any floor for any purpose, and that this was not a thing that Mercer considered relevant, and that she was finding, to her own moderate surprise, that she didn't consider it particularly relevant either. She told Derek to keep the bay status updates coming to her personal cell, took her jacket from the back of the chair where she'd draped it, and followed Mercer to the elevator. The 3rd floor at 4 in the morning was the administrative wing. Closed offices, carpeted corridors, the institutional quiet of a building's managerial layer when the actual work is happening 2 floors below. The lighting was the after-hours minimum, every 3rd fluorescent lit, the rest dim, the kind of cost-cutting that looked reasonable on a facility's budget and felt faintly oppressive at 4 a.m. Roland Prisk's office light was on. They could see it under the door from the elevator corridor. Mercer stopped outside it without knocking and listened for 2 seconds. A habit, Hannah recognized, not of rudeness but of information gathering, and then opened the door. Prisk was at his desk. He was a man in his mid-50s, the physical type that suggested a younger career in something more active and a current career in something sedentary. Broad-shouldered but soft now, the physicality still visible in the frame but no longer maintained. He had his desk phone receiver in his hand, and he looked up with the specific expression of a man who had been waiting for something and was not relieved that it had arrived. He put the receiver down without completing the call. "General Mercer," he said. He said it like he'd known the name was coming, which meant someone had told him, which meant the building's information was moving faster than the lockdown. "Mr. Prisk." Mercer moved into the room and stood in the center of it with the relaxed authority of a man who was comfortable in rooms he didn't own. "I think you already know why I'm here." Prisk's eyes moved to Hannah, and she saw the recognition, not of her as a threat, but of her as the nurse who'd been walked out at 2:14 a.m., which meant he'd known about that, which meant the sequence of tonight had been reported upward in real time. "I'd like to understand the legal basis for this visit," Prisk said. His voice was controlled, the voice of an administrator accustomed to managing confrontation through procedure. "Federal jurisdiction over a classified military asset, with a warrant for communications records currently being executed," Mercer said. "The basis is sufficient." He sat down in the chair across the desk as if he'd been invited. "I'm not here to arrest you, Mr. Prisk. I'm here to talk before the people who do that arrive, which will be in approximately 40 minutes. Prisk's eyes moved again. A fast calculation happening behind the composure. Hannah stayed near the door. She wasn't here to speak. She was here to watch, and to be visible, and to be the specific reminder of everything that had already gone wrong with the plan this man had been part of tonight. "I was paged at 2:08, Prisk said carefully. "Regarding an incoming trauma patient, I logged into the administrative terminal to check resource allocation. And then I handled it administratively." "You were on the third-floor terminal at 2:09, Mercer said, "at the same time stamp that Dr. Lang pulled the patient's pre-arrival EMS report in the ER. You were paged 1 minute before that." He let a silence rest in the room. "What's the standard protocol for paging administrative staff about an incoming GSW patient at 2 in the morning?" The silence stretched. "There isn't one," Prisk said quietly. "No," Mercer agreed. "There isn't." Hannah watched Prisk's hands on the desk. Both flat, both still, the deliberate stillness of conscious control. He was doing the same math Lang had done downstairs, and arriving at the same place, the place where the documentation was already in federal custody, and the only remaining variable was his own posture going forward. But there was something in his face that Lang's face hadn't had. Lang had gone cold, shut down. Attorney, attorney, attorney. Prisk was looking at Mercer with something that had started as strategy and was developing, visibly, into something less comfortable. He was scared. Not of arrest, or not only that. The specific fear of a man who has been told what to do by people who have made it very clear what happens if the operation goes wrong, and the operation has gone very wrong, and those people are not yet in federal custody. Hannah saw it, and she thought Mercer saw it too, because he shifted forward in the chair by about 2 inches and said more quietly, "Mr. Prisk, I want you to think carefully about the next thing you say." Prisk looked at his hands. "I need assurances," he said. "I can't give you those." "Then I need—" He stopped, started again. "If I tell you what I know, I need to know that the people who sent me, that they can't—" He stopped again. Something genuine was moving through the composure now, cracked of surface. "They have reach inside this hospital. They have reach outside this hospital. If they find out I talked before you've contained them—" "We're already containing them," Mercer said. "You don't know all of them." "Tell me the ones I don't know." The room was very quiet. Down the hall, the elevator dinged softly, and someone walked in the other direction. Derek, probably, or a floor nurse. The normal sounds of a hospital at 4 a.m., completely indifferent to what was happening in this office. Prisk looked at Hannah. Not at Mercer. At her. She didn't know why, and then she thought she did, because she was the one who'd been walked out into the rain and come back in, and something about that specific fact had registered to him as a data point about how nights like this one ended. "There's a surgical coordinator on this floor," he said. "Second office down. Her name is Deborah Voss. She's been passing patient manifests, incoming high-value cases, trauma transfers, Anyone flagged in the system as military or federal to an external contact for 11 months. He said it with the flat tone of a man who has made a decision and is watching himself make it and has not yet determined if it was the right one. She was the one who flagged Holt's transport route to the network before EMS even loaded him. Mercer's expression didn't change. He stood up and stepped into the corridor and said something to the tactical officer who had followed them upstairs and who was now outside Prisk's door with the patient, removed efficiency of someone who had been ready for exactly this instruction. Hannah stayed in the doorway. Prisk looked at her again with the uncertain eyes of a man who had just moved from one kind of exposure to another and wasn't sure which was worse. "Will it matter?" he asked her. "That I told him." "I don't know," she said. Because she didn't, and because lying to him would have been the easier thing, and she had never been good at the easier thing. She heard Mercer's voice in the corridor, low and direct, and then the sound of a second office door opening, and then a woman's voice, sharp, startled, immediately controlled, saying, "What is this?" And Mercer's voice answering, steady as a flat road, "Sit down, Ms. Voss." Hannah turned back to Prisk. "Stay here," she told him. "Don't touch your phone. Don't call anyone. When the federal agents arrive, tell them exactly what you told the general." He nodded. A small, used-up movement. She went into the corridor. The second office was lit, and both Mercer and the tactical officer were inside with Deborah Voss, who was a woman in her late 40s with the look of someone who had been here for hours. Disheveled, but alert. The specific alertness of a person who has been waiting for bad news and is now receiving it. On the desk in front of her was a laptop that was open and running, and on the screen, Hannah caught 1 second of visible data before Mercer closed the lid. A communication interface, not a hospital system, something external, the kind of dark background encrypted chat window that didn't belong on a hospital administrator's work computer at 4 in the morning. The tactical officer placed both hands on the laptop. Voss looked at the screen where it had been and then looked at Mercer and said nothing. "The warrant covers this device," Mercer told her, "and everything on it." Voss's mouth pressed into a thin line. She looked older than she had when Hannah had first seen her face, 10 seconds ago. The alertness had turned into something else. Not panic, but the specific resignation of someone who had run the numbers and found that none of them worked. "I want immunity," she said. "That's a federal prosecutor's conversation," Mercer said. "Not mine. Then I'm not saying anything." "That's your right." He nodded to the tactical officer. "Secure the device. We'll wait for federal." Hannah's phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She stepped into the corridor and looked at the screen. Derek. Text, not call. Patient BP dropping. 8854. Vasquez asking for you. She was already moving toward the elevator. She hit the button, watched the numbers, willed it to move faster in the way that people do when they know it doesn't help, but the body needs somewhere to put the urgency. The doors opened, and she was in and pressing the lobby level before they had fully parted. The bay when she came through the door was a different configuration from the one she'd left. The Fort Graves team had the room reorganized around the chest tube placement, Vasquez on the left side of the bed, Okafor managing the airway, the scrub tech handling the instrument tray. The chest tube was in. She could see the drainage bottle, dark with blood, more than she'd have liked. The hemothorax decompressing, but the output volume telling her the bleed was faster than the CT had suggested it would be. Vasquez looked up. "Good. Come here." Hannah pulled gloves from the box on the wall and was at the bedside in 4 seconds. "Outputs 400 mils in 22 minutes, Vasquez said. "He's going to need the OR. I've already called it up, but I want a second set of eyes on this before we move him." She gestured at the drainage. "Tell me what you see." Hannah looked at the color and rate of drainage, looked at Mason's BP reading, looked at his face, still conscious, jaw set, eyes tracking, and thought about what a penetrating wound at that rib location could have nicked that would behave this way. "Intercostal vessel," she said. "Not the primary vessels, but not a capillary bleed either. It's been slower because of his pressure. As his BP normalized, it accelerated." She looked at Vasquez. "He needs the OR." Agreed. Vasquez was already speaking to Okafor about the anesthesia plan. Hannah put her hand on the bed rail, near Mason's hand without touching it, and he looked at her. "Or," she said. "I heard. You're going to be fine." "You don't know that." "No," she said. "But Vasquez is good. I watched her work for 90 seconds, and she's good. He considered this with the same economy he applied to everything. "You'll be here," he said. Not a question. "I'll be here." They moved him at 4:11 a.m., the Fort Graves team running the gurney with the efficient urgency of people who understood that 400 mils in 22 minutes had a math attached to it that didn't permit leisurely transit. Hannah walked with them to the OR corridor and then stopped at the door. Non-sterile personnel. She wasn't scrubbed. This was the line. And watched them take him through. The doors swung shut. The corridor was suddenly very quiet. She stood in it for a moment, alone, in her rain-damp jacket with no badge and no official standing, and a night that had been running at full capacity for 2 hours. The fluorescents in the surgical corridor were brighter than the rest of the hospital, the specific cold light of spaces that needed to see everything. She turned back toward the ER. She had been walking for about 30 seconds when she heard it. Not loud, just distinct. The sound of a door opening at the far end of the corridor and 2 sets of footsteps, one of them wrong. Not wrong as in unfamiliar. Wrong as in the specific irregularity of someone moving under duress. The constrained, deliberate gait of a person being managed by another person, and working very hard not to show it. She stopped. The corridor turned at the far end. The footsteps were coming from around that turn, heading toward the stairwell access, not the elevator, which told her something about whoever was moving and why they'd chosen that route. She pressed to the wall and waited. 2 people came around the corner. The first was a woman she didn't recognize, mid-30s, civilian clothes, the kind of alert composure that didn't belong in a hospital at this hour. The second was Derek. Derek's eyes found Hannah, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man walking with a colleague. His hand was at his side, slightly behind him, and he was holding it oddly, rigid, the fingers slightly spread, and the woman behind him had her right hand in her jacket pocket. In the particular way that meant there was something in the jacket pocket that was not a phone. The woman saw Hannah at the same moment Derek did. Everything stopped for 1 second. That specific compressed second that Hannah had experienced before, in darker places than this corridor, when a situation clarified from uncertain to absolute, and the only variable remaining was what you did with the first half second. The woman said, "Step away from..." Hannah had already moved, not toward them. Sideways to the wall panel she'd noticed on her way down this corridor, the one she'd cataloged without thinking about it, because cataloging exits and utilities was not a choice she made, but a thing her brain did automatically in any space she entered. She hit the crash alarm. The corridor exploded into light and sound. Strobing emergency overhead, alarm tone at a volume that was designed to reach every floor of the building. And from somewhere behind her she could already hear the response, the sound of running feet and radio traffic, and the specific controlled chaos of a hospital emergency response activating. The woman with the jacket pocket made a decision in about half a second. She ran. Not toward Hannah. Toward the stairwell she'd been aiming for before the alarm, which told Hannah she had an exit plan, and the alarm had accelerated it rather than stopped it. She hit the stairwell door and it banged open, and she was through it before the first responders had rounded the near corner. Derek stumbled forward 2 steps and caught himself on the wall. He was breathing wrong, shallow and controlled, the breathing of someone managing pain. Hannah crossed to him in 3 steps and got her hands on him. Where? He shook his head, oriented himself. She came up behind me at the nurse's station. She had something, I don't know, some kind of injection device. She said if I made a sound. He looked at his right forearm, where his sleeve was pushed up, and there was a small puncture mark, already bruising. Hannah's hands went cold. What did she inject? She said. I don't know. She was already on her radio, the one Mercer's team had given her an hour ago without making a large event of it. This is Brooks. I need the general on the surgical floor corridor immediately, and I need toxicology consult for a possible injection exposure, unknown substance. My colleague has a puncture mark, right forearm. He's conscious and ambulatory, but... Mercer's voice came back in 3 seconds. On my way. What's the subject? Female, mid-30s, civilian clothes, went into the south stairwell 30 seconds ago. She was moving Derek, a nurse, toward an exit. I've got her description. Hold position. Hannah kept her hand on Derek's arm and looked at the puncture mark and thought about a pharmacy access log and a list of drugs that had no clinical application together, and felt the cold specific arithmetic of what those drugs did, at what intervals, and what they looked like when they did it. Derek, she made him look at her. I need you to tell me exactly how you feel right now. Everything. Don't edit it. He swallowed. His face was doing something she didn't like. A slight, flushed quality to the skin. A blink that was fractionally slower than it should have been. I don't know. My arm hurts where she did it, and I feel... He paused. Weird, like something's wrong, but I can't locate it. She got him to the floor of the corridor, his back to the wall, and she put 2 fingers to his carotid and counted. Pulse rapid. 110, maybe 115. Skin warm, starting to sweat. She looked at his pupils, equal and reactive, but the reactivity was at the edge of what she'd call normal, 1 beat slow on the constriction. She was thinking about the drug combination on the printout, and about what each component would do individually, and about which of them worked fast and which worked slow, and about whether this was the beginning of something or the middle. Her radio crackled. Mercer. We have the subject, south stairwell, ground floor. She's in custody. I need to know what she injected into my colleague, Hannah said. Right now. Whatever she's carrying, whatever's on her, I need to know in the next 2 minutes. A pause. Working on it, she looked at Derek. His eyes were tracking, his breathing was elevated but regular, his color was off but not catastrophically. She had 2 minutes, maybe 3, before the picture changed or didn't, and the difference between those 2 outcomes was going to come down to what was in the syringe. The woman in the stairwell was currently being relieved of. Derek looked up at her from the corridor floor with the expression of a man who was trying very hard not to be frightened and not quite succeeding. Am I going to be okay? He asked. She pressed her fingers to his wrist and counted again, and looked at the clock on the wall and made the calculation with everything she had. I don't know yet, she said, but I'm not leaving. Her radio crackled again. Not Mercer this time. The analyst. His voice was tighter than it had been all night, the specific compression of someone delivering information they wished they didn't have. Brooks, I need you to hear this. A beat. We pulled the full communication log from the burner phone. Lang made a 5th call that we missed in the first pass, at 1:58 a.m., 14 minutes before the patient arrived. Another beat. The call went to a number registered to a contracting shell company. We ran the company. The analyst paused. It has 3 subsidiary addresses. One of them is a medical supply firm based in Denver that services 17 hospitals across Colorado and Wyoming. Hannah waited. Crestview Regional is one of them, he said. They had a service technician in this building yesterday afternoon. He had access to the pharmacy floor and the surgical supply rooms. A final pause. The kind that means what comes next is the part that changes the shape of everything. We pulled his badge access record. I was in the IV prep room for 41 minutes. She looked at the IV line going into Derek's arm. The IV line that had been running since before the Fort Graves team arrived. The IV that had been set up by the overnight staff using supplies from this hospital's own stores. She was already reaching for the line. She pulled the IV line at the insertion site, not ripping it, controlled, 2 fingers pinching off the tubing above Derek's arm before she disconnected it, minimizing any final drip from whatever was running through it. Don't move your arm, she told him. She held the disconnected line up to the corridor light and looked at the fluid in the tubing. It looked like saline. It was supposed to look like saline, that was the point. She capped the line end with her thumb and radioed Mercer. I need the IV bag from Bay 4 pulled immediately. The one running when the Fort Graves team arrived. Do not discard it. It needs to go to toxicology as potential evidence. And I need a replacement saline line run from sealed stock, unopened packaging, nothing from this hospital's current supply. A beat. Understood, Mercer said. What are you thinking? The service technician had 41 minutes in the IV prep room. That's not a service visit. That's enough time to compromise a significant portion of the prepared IV stock. She looked at the capped line in her hand. If Mason Holt's line was set up from existing hospital stock before the Fort Graves team brought their own supplies. He's in surgery, Mercer said. I know. A silence. I'll get Vasquez on the radio, he said. Hannah crouched next to Derek and put her free hand to his wrist again. Pulse had not worsened, still elevated, still irregular in the way that anxiety elevated and irregularized things, but not deteriorating. She looked at the puncture mark on his forearm. Small gauge, the kind of device that was designed to be used fast and not noticed. Still weird? She asked him. Still weird. He swallowed. Less, maybe. Or I'm just getting used to it. Tell me if that changes. You'll be the first to know. She almost smiled. He was scared and holding it together and making a small joke, which was the most human possible response to the situation, and she appreciated it more than she would have known how to say. The sound of running feet from the elevator corridor met. Two of Mercer's team coming around the corner at a pace that was fast without being panicked, the trained urgency of people who moved quickly without broadcasting it. One of them had a med kit, the other had a radio. Toxicology's been paged, the first one said to Hannah. They're pulling the Bay 4 bag now. General's on with Vasquez. The second one was already on a knee next to Derek, opening the kit. Hannah gave a fast verbal handoff, estimated injection time, observed vital signs, pupillary response, current pulse, and stepped back to let them work. Not because she was done thinking about Derek, because there were things only she could do right now, and sitting with him was not one of them. She stood in the corridor and held the capped IV line and thought. The service technician. Yesterday afternoon, 41 minutes in IV prep. That meant the compromised stock had been in place before Mason Holt ever arrived, before Lang made his 1:58 a.m. call. The stock had been compromised as preparation, staged, the way you staged an asset before you needed it, which meant the network had known Mason Holt was coming to this hospital before last night, not just in time to pull a pre-arrival report, days before, long enough to send a technician in advance, which meant the leak was not in the EMS system. It was somewhere upstream. In Mason's transport plan, his route, his destination, information that would only exist in classified operational channels. She needed to tell Mercer that. She turned and walked back toward the ER bay, because Mercer's radio traffic was concentrated there and because the OR status board was visible from the nurse's station, and she needed to see it. The board showed Mason Holt in active surgery, OR2. Vasquez attending, Okafor anesthesia. Elapsed time 23 minutes. She looked at the elapsed time and thought about a chest bleed running at the rate the drainage output had suggested, and what 23 minutes of Vasquez's hands could accomplish. Mercer was at the nurse's station with his analyst and the third member of his tactical team, and the quality of their conversation, low, fast, the compressed efficiency of people processing new information, had changed since the third floor. He looked up when Hannah came through. She handed him the capped IV line. Possible compromised stock, needs testing. He handed it to the analyst without looking away from her. What else? He said. The service technician was here before last night, before the EMS report, before Lang's calls, before any of it. That means someone had Mason's transport routing in advance. That level of advance access is not an EMS leak. It's operational intelligence. She held his gaze. Someone inside his command structure. Mercer was very still for about 3 seconds. She watched him process it. The specific controlled absorption of a man for whom that possibility was not theoretical, who had existed long enough in the architecture of classified operations to know that inside leaks happened, who was still not comfortable with it and never would be. I've already flagged the transport chain, he said. There are 4 people who had access to his movement schedule. A pause. I was hoping the source was further out. It's not. No. He turned to his analyst. Cross-referenced the transport access list against the communication records from the burner network. All of it. Tonight. The analyst was already typing. Mercer looked back at Hannah. Something had shifted in the way he was looking at her. Not in a way that was visible to anyone watching from a distance, but she'd been reading people in close quarters for a long time and she caught it. A recalibration. The way a person's assessment of someone updates when the evidence keeps coming back the same way. You were a captain, he said. It wasn't a question. Medical officer, yes. Why'd you get out? She thought about how to answer that and settled on the part that was true without being the whole of it. I needed to stop for a while. And then you ended up here. Dunmore, Colorado has a low crime rate and reasonable rent, she said. And the overnight shift meant I didn't have to talk to many people. He looked at her for one more beat. That's a waste, he said. She didn't argue with it. She also didn't agree with it out loud, because the part of her that had spent 2 years being deliberately invisible was not quite ready to concede the point in front of a general at 4:30 in the morning in a hospital she'd been fired from. The OR status board blinked. The elapsed time now read 31 minutes. She turned to look at it. At 4:44 a.m., federal agents arrived. Not the local field office. Mercer had bypassed that layer entirely. These were counterintelligence, 3 of them, in the specific unmarked professional plainness that federal agents on serious operations wore, and they came through the ER entrance with credentials and a warrant packet that was thick enough to tell Hannah that whatever had been running for 14 months had a very large amount of documented foundation behind it. The lead agent was a woman named Ferris, compact, early 40s, the kind of face that had spent a long time not showing what it was thinking and had gotten very good at it. She spoke to Mercer for 4 minutes in the consultation room with the door closed, and then came out and spoke to her team in a way that set them moving in 3 different directions simultaneously. And then she walked to the nurse's station and looked at Hannah. "You're Brooks," she said. "Yes. You're the one who identified the pharmacy access record." Derek flagged the system alert. I interpreted it. Ferris considered this distinction, decided it wasn't one that interested her, and moved on. "We're taking custody of Lang, Prisk, and the Voss woman. The subject from the stairwell is already in federal transport." She looked at the board, at the analyst's workstation, at the evidence chain that had been building in this bay since before she arrived. "This is a cleaner chain than I usually walk into 4 hours out. The general's team is thorough. His team and you." Ferris picked up the printed pharmacy log from the evidence pile and looked at it. This read from the system alert. How did it surface? Hospital's internal pharmacy management system auto-generates alerts for unusual multi-drug access patterns after hours. Derek got the printout. He brought it to me. "And you knew what the combination meant?" "I have a clinical background." Ferris looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had read a file and was now comparing it to the person standing in front of them. "Combat medic, 4 years, 2 deployments, trauma certification." "Yes." "And you've been here 2 years?" "Yes." Ferris set the printout down. "That's an interesting choice." "People keep saying that." A corner of Ferris's mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was something. She turned back to her team. Lang was walked out of the consultation room at 4:51 a.m. He was not in restraints. Federal agents at this stage tended toward the functional minimalism of people who didn't need to perform authority. But the 2 agents on either side of him and the specific cadence of the walk left no ambiguity about the nature of the arrangement. He moved with the careful, conserved dignity of a man who had decided that maintaining posture was the last thing he controlled. He walked through the ER bay past the nurse's station and the trauma bays and the board with Mason Holt's OR status on it, and at no point did he look at Hannah. That was a choice too, a specific refusal to make eye contact with the person whose existence had unraveled his night. She understood the psychology. She didn't need him to look at her. She watched him go and felt something that was not satisfaction, exactly. More the specific absence of a weight she hadn't fully registered carrying. The low-grade, constant pressure of being in a building where someone with authority over her working life had decided she didn't matter. That was gone now, replaced by something quieter and more durable. Prisk came next from the elevator. He looked diminished in the way that people look diminished when they have made a confession, and the adrenaline of decision has metabolized into something duller. He glanced at Hannah as he passed, and she gave him nothing. Not hostility, not acknowledgement. He had traded information for the hope of leniency, and that was between him and federal prosecutors and whatever remained of his own judgment. Deborah Voss was last. She came out of the elevator flanked by 2 agents, her laptop in an evidence bag, her expression locked into the specific blankness of someone who had decided that showing anything at all was a form of concession. She walked through the bay without looking at anyone and went out the ambulance entrance into the dark. The bay was quieter after that, not empty. There were still patients, still staff, still the steady rhythm of a hospital running its overnight. But the acute operational pressure had released, and what remained was the specific, raw-edged quiet of a situation that had passed through its worst and was not yet sure what came next. Derek was sitting up on a gurney in Bay 2 with a toxicology nurse named Petra running a new IV line, sealed stock, brought in from a separate hospital supply, everything documented. His pulse had come down to 92. His color was better. Petra had taken a blood draw for a full tox panel, but the early read from the on-call toxicologist, who had come in within 20 minutes of being paged, was that the injection appeared to be a fast-acting anxiolytic compound, something that would have impaired Derek's judgment and physical resistance for long enough to get him out of the building, not something immediately lethal. She had held someone together with her hands. He was going to be okay. She stood at the edge of Bay 2 for a moment and let that land. "You should sit down," Derek told her from the gurney. "I'm fine. You've been standing for 3 hours. You have a needle mark in your arm." "And I'm sitting," he said. "Funny how that works?" She looked at him. He was trying to make her feel less responsible for the fact that he'd been used as leverage against her, and it wasn't working, but the trying mattered. "I'm glad you're okay," she said. "I'm glad you pulled that line." She nodded once and went back to the nurse's station. The OR board at 5:03 a.m. showed Mason Holt still in surgery, elapsed time 44 minutes. She looked at it and ran through what she knew about intercostal vessel repairs at this bleeding rate and what 44 minutes meant for a surgeon of Vasquez's visible caliber, and she arrived at a number she was willing to live with. Not comfortable. Willing. Mercer appeared at her shoulder. "Vasquez radioed in. They've controlled the bleed. She's closing." Hannah let out a breath she'd been managing for the better part of an hour. "Good," she said. "He's going to need recovery time," Mercer said. "Real recovery time. Weeks." "I know. He won't like it." "I know that too." Mercer was quiet for a moment. Down the corridor, Faris was directing her team through the final stages of evidence collection, her voice a steady, unhurried presence in the early morning quiet. "The IV bag from Bay 4 came back," Mercer said. She turned to look at him. "The toxicology prelim is showing a potassium additive at a concentration that would not be clinically standard," he said. "Enough to cause cardiac irregularity in a trauma patient already under physiological stress." He said it without inflection, the practiced neutrality of a man who processed bad information functionally because the alternative was non-functional. If Holt had been running that line through surgery, he wasn't, she said. The Fort Graves team brought their own supplies. Because you flagged the hospital stock. Because the analyst found the technician's access record. Because you told me to look at the timeline. Mercer was looking at her in the way he'd looked at her in the OR corridor, the updated assessment. "I want to say something to you, Captain Brooks. Formally." She waited. "The action you took in this bay at 2:17 a.m. was the correct action. The assessment was accurate, the technique was appropriate, the timing was the difference between a viable patient and a fatality." He said it the way he said everything, without ornamentation, just the content. "The decision to fire you for it was not only wrong clinically. In the context of what we now know about Dr. Lang's activities tonight, it may constitute obstruction of a federal investigation." He paused. "Your record will reflect what actually happened." She held his gaze and felt the words settle, not with the rush of vindication she might have expected, but with the quieter, heavier weight of being seen accurately after a long time of being seen wrong. It didn't fix 2 years. It didn't unfire her or give back the night she'd spent making herself smaller than she was. But it was true, and being told a true thing by a person who meant it was not nothing. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. It's documentation, not a favor." She almost smiled. At 5:19 a.m., Vasquez came through the OR corridor doors with her mask pulled down and the expression of a surgeon who had done the thing that needed doing and was satisfied with the outcome in the particular way that satisfaction existed in this profession. Not triumphant, just complete. "He's in recovery," she said. "We repaired the intercostal vessel, cleared the hemothorax. He lost significant volume, but we replaced it in surgery. BP is stable, 84s over 50s and trending up. He'll be off the vent in a few hours if he keeps going the direction he's going." She looked at Hannah. "Your read on the secondary bleed was exactly right. If we'd waited for morning rounds, we'd have lost him on the table." Hannah nodded. There was nothing else to say to that. "He was asking for you," Vasquez added. "In recovery. Before they put him under, he was asking whether you'd still be here." She was still here. She had been fired and walked out and rained on and walked back in and run 2 codes worth of clinical assessment in the span of 3 hours without a badge or a chart or any official standing, and she was still here. She went to recovery. Mason was in the first bay. Intubated still, but the vent rate tapering, his eyes closed, the gray under the skin pallor replaced by something more like the ordinary pallor of a large man who had lost blood and was now replacing it. She sat in the chair beside his bed and listened to the vent cycle and the monitor and the quiet and let her own system decompress the way it needed to. She had been awake for 22 hours. She looked at her hands, which were still and steady, which they had been through all of it, The needle decompression, the chest assessment, the IV line pull, the corridor alarm. She was not numb. She was tired and present and aware of every decision she had made tonight and what it had cost and what it had purchased, and the accounting felt, for the first time in 2 years, like one she could look at directly. Ferris appeared in the recovery bay doorway at 5:38 a.m. "We've completed the initial sweep," she said. 7 individuals in custody, including the 4 we identified here and 3 additional network contacts who were picked up in Denver and Colorado Springs in the last hour based on the communication records. She looked at the OR board on the wall, at Mason Holt's name. "The preliminary case includes conspiracy to commit assassination of a federal military asset, espionage-related offenses, and hospital fraud charges spanning 18 months. A pause. "It's going to get larger before it gets smaller." "The source in the transport chain," Hannah said. "We have a name," Ferris said. "It's being handled at a level above my clearance," which meant it was military intelligence, which meant it was going to disappear into a process Hannah would never see the output of, and someone who had access to Mason Holt's movement schedule was going to answer for it in a room that didn't have windows and didn't make the news. She was okay with that. She looked at Mason's face, at the specific, stripped-down stillness of a person in surgical recovery. All the deliberate composure gone. Just a man sleeping the way you sleep when your body has decided it is done negotiating. He looked older than she'd expected when she recognized him. 5 years was 5 years. She looked older too, probably. She didn't spend a lot of time thinking about it. "There's something else," Ferris said. Hannah looked at her. Ferris was holding a folder. Physical. Paper. The kind of folder that existed in the federal system for things that weren't going in a digital file yet. She held it toward Hannah. "This was in Lang's office," she said. "Locked in his personal files. We pulled it about 20 minutes ago." Hannah took the folder and opened it. It took her a few seconds to understand what she was looking at. Then it took her a few more seconds to understand what she was feeling about it. It was a personnel file. Her personnel file. Not the hospital's version, but a compiled document that drew from multiple sources: her military records, her medical certifications, her service history, her deployment records, her rank, her unit, her commendations. 2 pages of operational notes from her overseas postings that should not have been accessible to a civilian physician at a regional hospital in Colorado under any standard process. Someone had built a file on her. Not recently. The document metadata, which Ferris had annotated in pencil at the top of the first page, showed a compilation date of 11 months ago. 11 months. Long before tonight. She looked at the operational notes, 2 pages, specific, accurate, and thought about what it meant that Lang had her military history in his personal files. Not to help her. Not for any clinical purpose. A file on her background, her training, her capabilities. A file on what she could do if she got in the way. "He knew who I was," she said. "For almost a year," Ferris confirmed. Hannah looked at the folder and thought about 11 months of Lang knowing her full background and still treating her as someone beneath notice. Still dismissing her assessments. Still speaking over her in front of families. The performance of contempt from a man who knew exactly what she was capable of. Not ignorance. Strategy. The safest way to manage someone you were afraid of was to make them invisible. Make them doubt themselves. Make the people around them doubt them. Keep them small enough that when the moment came, when the operation required it, there was no credibility attached to anything they said. She thought about 2 years of that. She closed the folder. Her hand was steady. She was not going to perform anything in front of Ferris. Not anger, not the particular devastation of understanding that the diminishment had been deliberate. Those were real things, and they would have their time, but not here, not at 5:40 in the morning in a recovery bay. She handed the folder back. "That stays in evidence," she said. "Yes," Ferris said. "It does." Ferris left. The recovery bay was quiet again. The vent cycled. The monitor held. Derek texted her from Bay 2. "Tox panel shows lorazepam derivative, fully metabolic. They say, I'll be fine by morning. Thank you for the line pull." She typed back, "Glad you're okay," and put the phone in her pocket. She sat in the chair beside Mason Holt and was quiet for a while. At 6:07 a.m., Mercer came in. He didn't sit. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the monitor and then at her. And she could see that he had been on calls since Ferris arrived. His demeanor had the specific texture of someone who had been communicating upward through a chain and receiving information back that was altering the operational picture. "The network is larger than the 14-month investigation indicated," he said. The Colorado Springs arrest turned up a second layer. A parallel operation that's been running communications through civilian medical institutions in 3 states, hospitals. He let that sit for a moment. Crestview Regional was not the only one. She absorbed this. "How many?" she asked. "We don't have a full number yet, at least 4, possibly 7. He looked at the folder under his arm, a copy of the same compilation she'd just held. "The fact that they built a file on you suggests you were flagged as a risk to the operation at this location specifically. Someone made a call about how to handle that risk." "Lang made the call," she said. "The file is his." "Lang received the instruction," Mercer said. "The file construction required access to military records that Lang could not have obtained independently. Someone with clearance authorized it." Which circled back to the transport chain leak, which circled back to the name Ferris had said was being handled at a level above her clearance. Someone inside. Not just Mason's transport schedule. Hannah's records. Her file. "How long have I been a target?" she asked. Mercer was quiet for a beat. "That's what we're trying to establish," he said. She looked at Mason's face. Sleeping, stable, alive because she'd reached for a needle at 2:17 a.m. and done the things she knew how to do regardless of what anyone in the room thought about whether she should. She thought about 11 months of deliberate invisibility, enforced from outside as much as chosen from inside. She thought about the overnight shift and the quiet, and the making herself smaller, and how some of that had been her own choice, and some of it, she now understood, had been managed. They had known who she was, and they had kept her contained. She had stayed contained because she'd told herself she needed the rest. She looked at the monitor, BP reading 91/58, still climbing. "I need to know," she said. "Everything you find. I'm not going to wait for a debrief that gets scheduled in 6 weeks." "You'll be briefed," Mercer said. "When?" "Soon." That's not an answer. He looked at her. "No," he said. "It's not." A pause, the kind that preceded a decision rather than followed one. "When Holt is out of recovery and stable enough to talk, the 3 of us will sit down. Everything on the table. You have my word." She accepted that. Not because she trusted the institution, she had complicated feelings about institutions in general, but because she trusted the specific quality of Mercer's word, which he delivered without performance and without the particular softness that people used when they were going to walk it back later. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. He reached into the folder under his arm and removed a single document. Not the personnel file, something else. A printed form. Official letterhead. Army Special Operations Command. He placed it on the chair arm beside her. She looked at it. It was a formal notification of record correction. Her military service record, flagged for administrative review, with a recommendation appended from Mercer's office that her discharge status be reviewed in light of operational contributions during her service period that had been, the document said, incompletely documented. She looked up at him. "That's been submitted," he said. "Not pending. Submitted." She didn't know what to do with that. The honest answer was she didn't know what to do with most of tonight. Not the file, not the 2 years of managed invisibility, not the fact that the man she'd saved twice was breathing in the bed beside her because of decisions she'd made with 30 seconds of margin and no official authorization. She put her hand flat on the document. "What happens next?" she asked. Mercer picked up the folder. "Federal investigation runs its course. It'll take months. You'll be called as a witness for the medical board proceedings against Lang and the federal criminal case. The hospital will be under external administration review within the week." He paused. "And in the meantime, I'd like you to consider a conversation about a different kind of next." She looked at him. "Formally," he said, "when the time is right." She didn't answer, not because she didn't have one, but because the answer was not yet a thing she was ready to say out loud at 6 in the morning in a recovery bay with the rain finally stopping outside and the first gray light of a Colorado dawn beginning to show through the window at the end of the corridor. Mason's monitor beeped its steady rhythm. She looked at the window. She looked at the document under her hand. She thought about 11 months of a file being built on her, about 2 years of making herself small, about the overnight shift and the quiet, and the careful arrangement of a life that asked nothing of her and therefore gave her nothing back. And she thought about a 14-gauge needle and a man breathing. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Colorado Springs area code. She looked at it for 3 full seconds. Mercer was already gone. She hadn't heard him leave, which told her he moved the way he moved everywhere, without announcement. She was alone in the recovery bay with Mason's monitor and the dawn light and an unknown number calling her personal phone from Colorado Springs at 6:11 in the morning. She answered it. A voice she did not recognize said, quietly and without preamble, "They didn't get everyone, Captain Brooks." The recovery bay was very still. "Who is this?" she said. "Someone who knows what Lang's file on you was actually for." A pause, measured and deliberate. "And someone who knows that the person who authorized building it is not in federal custody." She stood up slowly. "They're in this hospital," the voice said. "They've been here since before the Black Hawk landed." She kept her voice flat and her body still because the recovery bay had a window in the door and anyone in the corridor could see her through it. "How did you get this number?" she said. "The same way Lang got your military file," the voice said. "Through channels that shouldn't exist but do." A pause. "I'm not your enemy, Captain. I'm the reason the tox screen on the Bay 444 bag came back with a result instead of a false negative. I flagged the batch number to the toxicology lab 40 minutes ago." She processed that. The toxicologist had been specific and fast, unusually fast for a prelim screen. She had attributed it to Mercer's team pressure. She had been wrong. "Who are you?" she asked. "Someone who has been embedded in the network for 7 months under federal authority. Someone whose cover does not survive me telling you my name on an open line." The voice was careful and precise, the cadence of a person measuring every word against its cost. "What I can tell you is that the individual who authorized your personnel file and who coordinated the staging of this operation from inside this hospital is a physician, not Lang, not anyone federal agents have taken out of this building tonight." She was already moving toward the door, phone to her ear, her other hand flat against the doorframe. "Name," she said, "Dr. Adrienne Solano, Chief of Emergency Medicine. She came in at 3 a.m., 40 minutes after the Black Hawk landed, and she has not left. She's been in her office on the 2nd floor managing communications with the remaining network nodes since she arrived." The voice dropped a register. "She knows the operation is compromised. She's been shredding documentation for the last hour." Hannah pushed through the recovery bay door into the corridor. "Why are you telling me instead of Mercer?" she said. "Because I tried to reach Mercer's encrypted line 4 minutes ago and got no response. And because you're the only person in this building tonight who has demonstrated consistent, accurate judgment under pressure without institutional support." A pause that felt weighted rather than uncertain. "Also because Solano specifically flagged you as the primary operational risk in the Lang file. She wrote the assessment herself." Another pause. "She underestimated you. I'd like to see that matter." The line went dead. She stood in the corridor for 2 seconds with the phone in her hand, and then she moved. She found Mercer at the ambulance bay entrance, speaking with Ferris's second agent. She walked up and interrupted, which she would not have done an hour ago and did not hesitate about now. "Dr. Adrienne Solano, Chief of Emergency Medicine, 2nd floor. Embedded network coordinator, been in her office since 3 a.m., currently destroying documentation." She said it in the compressed, sequenced style of a field report, facts in order, no preamble, no hedging. "I received an anonymous call from what appears to be a federal undercover asset who couldn't reach your encrypted line. They flagged her as the authorizing source for my personnel file and the operational coordinator for tonight." Mercer and the agent exchanged exactly one look. "Get Ferris," Mercer said. The agent was already moving. Mercer looked at Hannah. "The call came to your personal number." "Yes." "You trust it?" She thought about the talk screen, about the batch number flag, about the specific, accurate details. Solano's name, her role, her office, her 3 a.m. arrival time, delivered by someone who'd had access to the network's internal picture. "Enough to act on it," she said. "Not enough to stake everything on without verification." "Good enough." He turned toward the elevator. "You're with me." They went up with Ferris and 2 agents, taking the stairwell rather than the elevator because the elevator announced arrival and the stairwell didn't. The 2nd floor was administrative, like the 3rd but heavier. Department heads' offices, conference rooms. the kind of carpeted corridor that communicated hierarchy through its own quietness. Dr. Adrienne Solano's office was at the far end corner position, the office of someone who had spent a career accumulating the specific privileges that came with institutional seniority. The light under her door was the only light in the corridor. Ferris didn't knock. She opened the door with the flat authority of a federal agent who had a warrant that covered the building and everyone in it, and the four of them moved into the office, and Dr. Adrienne Solano looked up from behind her desk. She was a woman in her early 60s, white-haired, small-framed, the kind of physician whose authority had long ago become environmental. It lived in the room rather than in her posture, accumulated over decades until people felt it without being able to point to its source. She had a small paper shredder running on the floor beside her desk. On the desk in front of her were two stacks of documents, one intact, one already fed. She looked at Ferris, at the agents, at Mercer, at Hannah. Her eyes stayed on Hannah for one beat longer than the others. "I've been expecting someone," she said. Her voice was measured and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had decided that the only remaining variable she controlled was her own presentation. "I didn't expect you specifically." She was still looking at Hannah. "You've had quite a night." "Shut the shredder off," Ferris said. Solano reached down and switched it off without looking away from Hannah. "How much did you get through?" Ferris asked one of her agents, who had moved immediately to the shredder and the remaining desk stacks. "Partial," the agent said, examining the shred bin. "The intact stack looks substantial." Ferris turned to Solano. "Step away from the desk." Solano stood slowly, with the deliberate pace of a woman who was not going to be hurried in her own office even now, and moved to the far side of the room. She was wearing her white coat, which struck Hannah as a choice, that she'd put it on at 3 a.m. to come here, that she'd sat in it for 3 hours while the operation she'd coordinated collapsed floor by floor below her. The coat, the office, the title, the accumulated weight of 40 years of institutional standing, all of it was over, and Solano knew it, and she was wearing the coat anyway. "You built the file on me," Hannah said. She hadn't planned to say it first, but it was the thing that was in the room, and Solano was looking at her in a way that seemed to expect it, and there was something Hannah needed to understand that no document was going to explain. "I assessed the risk profile of every individual in this building who had a background that could interfere with the operation," Solano said. "Yes, you were one of them. 11 months ago. 11 months ago, your file came to my attention. Army combat medicine background, trauma certification, the specific skills that would be problematic if a military asset arrived here in crisis, and the treatment plan needed to be managed." Solano said it with the clinical detachment of someone describing a procedure, not a crime. "You were an obstacle. The appropriate response was to ensure you had no standing to interfere." "So you kept me on overnight shifts," Hannah said. "You let Lang treat me as invisible. You made sure I stayed small enough that nothing I said would carry weight." "It was effective," Solano said, "until it wasn't." The room was quiet enough that Hannah could hear the agent carefully removing documents from the shredder intake tray. "Why?" Hannah asked. "Not the operational why." She understood the operational why. "The other one. You're a physician. You've been practicing for decades. You took patients. You treated people. And then you—" She stopped, because the sentence had several possible ends, and none of them were questions she was going to get honest answers to. Solano looked at her with something that was not guilt and not pride, but a specific, uncomfortable combination of genuine conviction and the awareness that conviction alone did not constitute justification. "People with power make decisions about which assets are expendable," she said. "I decided I would be the one making those decisions rather than the one being decided about." A pause. "I was wrong about you. That is the only thing I'll concede tonight." It was, Hannah thought, a deeply human form of corruption, not the cartoonish self-interest of someone who'd never had principles, but the more dangerous kind that had once had them, and quietly, incrementally, traded them for something that felt like control. Ferris moved between them. "Dr. Solano, you're under arrest." She read the charges. Solano listened with her hands at her sides and her chin level and her white coat straight, and when Ferris finished, she said, to no one in particular, "I'd like my attorney," and the performance of composure held until the agent took her arm to move her toward the door, and then something in it cracked. Not into panic, not into tears, just a single blink, fast and reflexive, the involuntary response of a body registering the end of something. And then the composure came back and she walked. She passed Hannah in the doorway. She didn't look at her again. Hannah stood in the corridor and watched them take Adrienne Solano to the elevator, and she felt the specific, exhausted finality of a night arriving at its last piece. Not triumphant, not even relieved exactly. The way the end of something long and grinding feels. Not like winning, but like the cessation of a sustained pressure, the first breath you take when you didn't know you'd been holding it. She went back downstairs. Mason was out of recovery and into a private room on the surgical floor by the time she got back down. Vasquez had approved the transfer at 6:40 a.m., which told Hannah his vitals were stable enough to move and his airway was clear enough to extubate. She found him in room 114 with the vent gone, an oxygen cannula in place, a new IV running sealed Fort Graves stock, and the particular alert stillness of a man who had come back from surgery and was taking inventory. He looked at her when she came in. "You look terrible," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation tube, but functional. "You had a chest tube 40 minutes ago." "I know what I had. I'm telling you what I see." He tracked her as she moved to the bedside. "What happened?" She told him. All of it. Solano, the call, the office, the shredder, the arrest. She told it the same way she'd reported everything tonight. Sequenced, factual, no editorializing on the parts that were still sitting in her chest unprocessed. She would process them later, in a quiet room, alone, the way she had always processed the things that cost her. Not by performing them, but by sitting with them until they settled into something she could carry. Mason listened without interrupting. This was one of the things she remembered about him from Kandahar, that he was a man who did not interrupt, who absorbed information with the full weight of his attention and reserved his response for after he had it all. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The person who called you," he said, "the undercover asset. I don't know who they are." "You trusted the information." "I trusted that the details were specific enough and accurate enough that acting on it was the better risk than not acting on it." She looked at him. 70% confidence with a time-sensitive target is usually enough to move. "Usually," he said. "It was tonight." He held her gaze. "Yeah," he said. "It was." She sat down in the chair beside his bed because her legs had been making a sustained argument for this for the past hour, and she had run out of reasons to refuse them. The surgical floor was waking up around them. Shift change sounds, the breakfast cart in the corridor, the specific brightening quality of a hospital in early morning when the overnight tension begins to metabolize into the routines of daytime. Outside the window, Dunmore, Colorado was arriving at a gray and rain-washed sunrise. The clouds from the night had thinned enough to show light coming through them. Not dramatic, not the kind of sunrise that announced itself, just the steady, unremarkable return of visibility after a long dark. She looked at it and thought about 2 years. Not with bitterness, exactly. Bitterness required the belief that things should have gone differently, and she wasn't sure she believed that anymore. The 2 years had made her invisible in a specific way that meant she was here tonight, in this building, at 2:17 a.m., with a 14-gauge needle and the clinical certainty that came from 4 years of doing this in conditions that made a Colorado ER look controlled. If she had been more visible, Solano might have removed her from the building entirely. Transferred her, manufactured cause for termination, found a cleaner way to manage the risk. The invisibility had been used against her and had also, without anyone intending it, been the thing that kept her in position. She didn't find that comforting exactly, but she found it true. Mercer arrived at 7:15 a.m., as promised. He came in with the folder under his arm and the specific quality of a man who had been managing multiple urgent channels simultaneously for 5 hours, and was now, for the first time, allocating attention to something that was not immediately operational. He sat down across from Hannah and looked at Mason and said, "How are you?" "Operational," Mason said. "You're not operational. You're in a hospital bed." "Operationally, I'm fine." Mercer looked at Hannah. She gave him a small expression that communicated she had made the same argument and it had produced the same result. "Solano is in federal custody," Mercer said. "The communication records from her office, including what the agents recovered from the partial shred, are going to significantly expand the case. Ferris is describing it as the most complete documentation of network infrastructure they've pulled in 18 months of investigation." He set the folder on the bedside table. 14 individuals in custody across Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico. The operation is dismantled. The remaining nodes went dark in the last 40 minutes, which means they know it's over. The source in the transport chain, Mason said. Mercer's jaw tightened by a fraction. In custody as of 30 minutes ago, Fort Leavenworth. The details are above the classification level of this room. Mason looked at the window, processed it, put it somewhere. And Brooks, he said. Mercer opened the folder. He placed 3 documents on the bedside table. The first was the formal record correction Hannah had already seen, submitted, as Mercer had said, not pending. The second was a letter from the Colorado Medical Board, bearing a same-day issue date that told her Mercer's people had been making calls since before sunrise. It acknowledged the circumstances of her termination from Crestview Regional Medical Center, noted that the termination had occurred under the influence of a bad faith clinical authority compromised by criminal activity, and formally cleared her record of any adverse action. The third was something she hadn't seen yet. She picked it up. It was an appointment letter. Army Special Operations Command, Medical Division. Captain Hannah Brooks, reactivated at her previous rank, assigned to a newly established military emergency medical response unit currently in the formation stage. Role Unit Lead, Trauma Protocols, and Field Medicine Standardization. Reporting date listed as conditional on her acceptance. She read it twice. She looked at Mercer. This was already written, she said. I had it drafted at 0400, he said. I was reasonably confident by then that the evening was going to end in a way that made it appropriate. Reasonably confident. 90%. What was the other 10%? That you'd say no, he said. She looked at the letter. She looked at Mason, who was watching her with the attentive neutrality of a man who was very deliberately not influencing her decision and was finding it slightly difficult. What is the unit? She said. Mercer leaned forward. Military medical assets embedded at civilian institutions and regional medical centers, the gap that tonight exposed. We have classified personnel moving through civilian medical systems with no protocol for what happens when they arrive injured and without documentation. We have civilian medical staff with military backgrounds being underutilized at best and systematically suppressed at worst. He held her gaze. The unit would develop the protocols, train the personnel, and maintain a response capacity for exactly the kind of situation that occurred tonight. With a team, with resources, with standing. She held the letter and thought about 2 years of overnight shifts and making herself quiet and the specific loneliness of knowing what you could do and choosing not to do it because the room you were in didn't have space for it. She thought about the tent in Kandahar in 2019 and a soldier who had remembered her name for 5 years. She thought about Derek on the corridor floor and a 14-gauge needle and a man breathing. She had told herself she was resting. She had been hiding. There was a difference, and she had known it for a long time. And it had taken a night like this one to make her stop pretending otherwise. She set the letter down on the bedside table. I want the unit's protocols to include a classification review process for any civilian medical staff with military backgrounds working at covered institutions, she said. Not surveillance. The opposite. So we know who our people are, and they're not being managed into invisibility by bad actors. Agreed, Mercer said. And I want the training program to cover this specific scenario. Not abstractly. This exact sequence, classification gap, civilian trauma setting, no documentation, time pressure. I want every military medic who transitions out to know what to do if they end up in a situation like tonight. That's the job, Mercer said. That's exactly the job. She picked up the letter. She held it for a moment. Then she looked at Mason, who had been quiet through all of it with the specific restraint of a man exercising considerable self-discipline. Say whatever you're not saying, she told him. I'm not saying anything. You're saying it very loudly. The corner of his mouth moved. I'm just observing that it took you about 30 seconds to start redesigning the unit. I have opinions. You've always had opinions. He looked at her with the directness of someone who had survived a tent in Kandahar and a Colorado ER in the same lifetime and was not in the business of leaving important things unsaid. They were right then. They're right now. She looked at the letter one more time. She signed it. Mercer took it back without ceremony, which she appreciated. No handshake, no moment. He folded it into the folder and stood and said, "Welcome back, Captain," in the same tone he used for everything, flat, genuine, without decoration, and left the room. She sat with Mason in the quiet that followed. "You should sleep," she told him. "Probably. Your blood pressure is still 40 points below where I'd like it. It's trending. Trending is not there." He shifted against the pillow, carefully, managing the chest tube sight with the practiced economy of a man who had navigated post-surgical discomfort before and was not going to let it run his day. "You're going to be insufferable as a unit lead," he said. "You're going to be a terrible recovery patient." "We already established that." "Hours ago," she agreed. Outside the window, the sunrise had fully arrived, thin and gray and cold, the kind of Colorado morning that didn't promise warmth but delivered light, and light was sufficient. The hospital was in full daytime operation now, the sounds of it reaching even this private room, carts and voices, and the particular organized hum of a large institution running its ordinary functions, indifferent to the extraordinary things that had happened inside it in the last 5 hours. She would be called as a witness. Many times, for many proceedings, the medical board hearing on Lang, which Ferris's team projected would result in permanent license revocation within 90 days. The federal criminal trial for Solano, Prisk, Voss, and the network contacts, which would take longer and run through multiple jurisdictions. The military tribunal for the transport chain leak, which would happen in rooms she'd never see. She would give testimony, she would submit documentation, she would be asked to recount tonight in the precise, factual language of legal record. And she would do it as many times as it required because that was how the accounting worked. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulated, grinding, necessary process of making a record that could not be walked back. She was okay with that. She had always been better at the sustained work than the dramatic moment. The dramatic moment was just the point at which the sustained work became visible. She stayed in Mason's room until 8 a.m. when Vasquez came for rounds and gave Hannah a look that communicated professionally and without hostility that the patient needed rest more than company. Hannah stood and gathered her jacket from the chair back. Mason caught her eye as she moved toward the door. "Brooks?" She stopped. "Thank you," he said. Simple. No elaboration. The way he'd said everything tonight, without extra weight because the weight was already there and didn't need performing. "Twice now," she said. "I know." A pause. "I'll try to make it less of a habit." "Please do," she said. "I'd like to sleep eventually." She went out. The walk from Mason's room to the ER took her down 2 corridors and a stairwell, past the surgical board and the administrative wing and the overnight nurses' station where Derek was being discharged from Bay 2 with a bandaged arm and instructions to take 48 hours off, which he was clearly already arguing with. She stopped at the Bay 2 entrance. "Go home," she told him. "I feel fine." "You were injected with a lorazepam derivative by a network operative at 5 in the morning." "I feel mostly fine." "Derek," he looked at her. "I was 26 and had survived the most frightening night of his career with a needle mark and a gallon of adrenaline and had been steadier through most of it than people twice his age would have been." "Are you coming back?" he asked. "To the hospital." "No," she said. And then, because it was true, and because he deserved the honest answer, "Not as a nurse, but I'll make sure what happened here doesn't get buried. Your name goes in the record. You flagged the pharmacy alert. That matters." He nodded. He was trying not to look like that mattered to him, and it clearly did. "Go home," she said again, more gently. She kept walking. She went through the ER bay one more time, not because she needed to, but because it was there, and the night had started there, and something in her needed the full circle. The bay was running its ordinary morning operations. 2 patients, day shift nurses taking over from night. The charge desk processing paperwork. Nobody looked at her with particular attention. She was a woman in a rain-damp jacket passing through a room that had, a few hours ago, been the center of something significant and was now just a hospital bay doing its work. She stopped in the doorway for one moment and looked at the trauma table. The table where she'd stood with a 14-gauge needle and made a decision that the room told her not to make, and her training and her hands told her was the only correct one. The table where Lang had told security to remove her, and where Mercer had told him she stayed. The table that was now just a table, clean and repositioned and ready for whoever came through the ambulance bay next. She left. The ambulance bay door opened and the morning air came in, cold, still carrying some of the night's rain and the smell of it, but lighter. She stood in the concrete shelter of the bay for a moment before walking out to the parking lot, and she looked at the sky, which was the specific shade of pale gray that comes after a storm when the clouds haven't cleared entirely, but the weight has gone out of them. Her car was where she'd left it. She stood beside it and didn't get in immediately, because the drive home could wait 2 minutes, and she needed 2 minutes. She was tired in a way that went past physical, the particular exhaustion of a night that had asked everything and received it. She had given tonight what she had, and what she had turned out to be more than 2 years of an overnight shift had suggested. That was not a comfortable thing to know. It would have been easier if the night had confirmed that she was right to be quiet, right to be small, right to want nothing beyond the minimum. Instead, it had confirmed the opposite. Some people spend years making themselves smaller because they've been told the room can't hold them. They adjust. They accommodate. They tell themselves it's practical, it's mature, it's knowing their place in the context of things. And sometimes what's actually happening is that the room is being managed by people who need them small, people who have read the file, who understand the threat, who know that the most dangerous thing in any compromised system is someone who knows what they're doing and isn't afraid to do it. Hannah had been that person for 2 years without knowing she was being kept that way. She knew it now. She thought about the unit, the formation stage, the blank page quality of something not yet built, the specific and terrifying freedom of being told to design something from the ground up with real resources and real authority. She was going to make mistakes. She was going to build protocols that needed revision and train people who challenged her assumptions and encounter situations she hadn't planned for. She was not going to be perfect at it. She was going to be good at it. There was a difference, and it was the only difference that mattered. She got in the car. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel, looking at the hospital entrance through the windshield. The sliding doors opened and closed. An ambulance pulled into the bay. A nurse came out for a break and stood with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. The ordinary machinery of a place that kept running regardless of what happened inside it, because people kept arriving who needed it. She started the engine. She had a few weeks before the reporting date on the appointment letter. A few weeks to sleep, to close out the apartment, to deal with the paperwork of a life transitioning from one thing to another. A few weeks to sit with the file that had been built on her and the 2 years that had been engineered around her, and let those things be what they were. Not the defining story, not the wound she'd carry forever, but part of the record, part of what had happened. Documented and accounted for and finished. She pulled out of the parking lot. At the first light, she looked in the rearview mirror at the hospital receding behind her. Crestview Regional, gray in the morning light, ordinary from the outside, the building where she had been walked out in the rain and walked back in and saved a life and exposed a network and signed a letter and started something new. She had left that building as a disgraced nurse once already tonight. She left it now as something she had always been and had spent 2 years pretending not to be. The light changed. She drove toward the sunrise. This story belongs to the people who have ever been told they were too much and made themselves less. To the ones who learned to take up less space because the room required it, who swallowed what they knew because nobody in the room wanted to hear it, who told themselves it was practical, and then watched the years pass and wondered what it cost. The truth is harder than the compromise and worth more than the comfort. The room does not get to decide what you're worth. Your hands know. Your training knows. The moment when everything is on the line and someone needs exactly what you have, that moment does not ask for your credentials or your badge or the permission of the person who told you to step back. It just asks if you're ready. Hannah Brooks was ready. She had always been ready.